when I use the word peripheral, Mark, I think the way I used it was, I think marketing has to be the core of the organization, but I think we lost what I call as the strategic view of the company. I think that's really where I think a CMO's role needs to be there, and we just started looking at probably the what I call as the fluff rather than the stuff, right?
Mm,
So that's
mm,
really where I think that that's really the reason why we lost influence, which brings me into something that you do today, which is a framework that I think is absolutely brilliant in terms of humanized growth, right? You really talk about a framework for the new Da Vinci CMO, right? Where
yes.
is that an inspiration because you were in Woodstock and you had a lot of arts and crafts there, and therefore is that the reason you termed this the Da Vinci CMO? So I really love the imagery and the visualization a Da Vinci CMO would
Mm,
be. And can you talk to me a little bit about the Da Vinci CMO?
yes. If you'll allow me, I'll just pick up a previous point that you mentioned in your introduction, because I had a conversation last week with the founder of the LinkedIn B2B Institute, Jan Swartz, and he made an interesting point, I thought. So many companies don't do the strategic marketing as we describe it, or as I described it. However, they have product management. It's just not part of marketing. So they've spread out the responsibilities that we're talking about over multiple disciplines. And you have to ask yourself, well, if you're doing that effectively, are we just trying to, land grab by being against that? I think that's a valid question to ask. And I think the only really important criteria to the litmus test almost for is that working or not is to say, are all the pieces consistent with each other and aligned against one strategy and one view of what's happening in the world and where the world will go? Because brand management in many ways has a coordinating characteristic. And if the company has done that in a different way, a founder at Apple, I really don't think there was a need for a brand manager. The founder coordinated everything. And if you got out of line with what Steve Jobs thought was Apple should stand for, you got either hit or fired, but you got corrected. So it's not necessarily a bad thing that all these things don't sit in marketing. But if you have chosen to be a strategic marketer, and that's another point I forgot to make, over the last 15 years, while I described this transition, a lot of people have entered marketing that I would say are not strategic marketers, but they consider themselves real marketers. And they've done that part of the marketing and probably gone deeper and better than I will ever be able to go. And so we're now really talking about competing, perhaps complementary models of marketing. And I don't know if I'm ready to judge which is right or wrong, but I think there is a litmus test. Is it all ultimately coming together in a way that consumers say, wow, consistently you're outperforming against needs that I didn't even know were unmet on my part. Now to your question. We did a massive study around what characterizes growth over performing organizations. And we did that because, as you described, there was a sense of this lack of influence, this sense of being marginalized and not being invited in the room when the big growth discussions were taking place. And so we ultimately wanted to drill down to the role of the marketer, but we had to start with what characterizes growth over performing organizations so that we could then ask in those companies that are outperforming their peers, is the role of marketing the same as in other places or is it different? And the findings were very inspiring to me as a marketer and to many of the people that we've since engaged with the findings about. Because the study, and it's called the IRG Growth Study. I would encourage people to go to our website and read about it, the Institute for Real Growth.com, identified that growth organizations that are outperforming think differently about growth. Growth is a very interesting concept. We did over 750 in-depth conversations with CEOs, CFOs, and CMOs. And the first 20 minutes were always, when we say growth, what do you mean? growth, what is good growth? There's also a whole degrowth movement these days. I happen to think that biologically, growth is a good thing, that we are programmed to evolve and growth, and that channeling that growth in a good direction is what actually gets stuff done on this little place we call Earth. But if we start there and then say, so what is growth? What we found over a quant and qual growth study, we saw that these companies talk about growth differently. They don't define growth in terms of Friedman's, everything is about the shareholder. Forget about everything else. Friedman literally in 74 said, the only social purpose a company has is to drive the profit of its shareholders. And we can laugh about that, but in all honesty and painfully, that has dictated the last 50 years of business. So many leaders have almost weaponized the ability, starting with Jack Welch at GE, that turned that company from being a socially caring, feet in the middle of society organization that was as big as America was itself, to one where people were fired even if they did their job well, but just because they were in the bottom 20%. And his dictate was, you fire the bottom 20 so that you create space. We've come out of 50 years of work where really companies said, if we do this, and then everybody else can take that money and they can spend it on whatever charity they want, but that's the role that we have in society. And we've seen where that has taken us. The metrics, we talked about how digital brought a lot of metrics for marketing to prove itself. Well, the metrics of capitalism, let's take GDP, for example. I think everyone listening to this organization would say GDP is a good thing. If you increase GDP, you're doing well. But actually, there's some really crazy issues with GDP. For example, did you know that when you cut down a tree, rather than leave it standing in the forest, your GDP goes up?
Oh, is it?
A dead tree is worth more than a live tree. I have this from Paul Polman. It's not my original thought, but it was a shocking statement for me to hear the first time. Yes. Did you know that when you insulate your home against heat or cold, GDP goes down? When you throw away your food, GDP goes up. So many things are not right about some of the measures. So what we've seen on the one hand is a 50-year period of companies focusing more and more on profit, and at the same time, more and more people and peripherals getting damaged, notably Earth. If I can dump my wastewater into the river without any penalties, I'm going to do that, unless something else is guiding me. That's what GE literally did. Now it's being fined, but the system isn't closed. And as long as the system isn't totally closed and you're not really paying the total costs of the resources that you're using, and the fact that some of those resources aren't even replenishable, and if you're I was in India not that long ago, and I couldn't see the Taj Mahal for the smog. No wonder is it that after 50 years of this, society has been pushing back louder and louder and saying, well, companies, you know what, you say growth is good. Well, I'm not so sure. Growth for whom? For you, for your shareholders, or for everyone? For the town that you're in, for the people that work on your lines. So there's been a burgeoning, and I think slowly moving into avalanche quality movement that says, hang on, we can't just keep growing thinking that we only create value for shareholders. And I think Bill Gates gets a lot of credit for raising this in Davos in 2008. He said, capitalism will be expelled if we keep doing this. So a whole bunch of different descriptors like conscious capitalism and caring capitalism. Porter published in the HBR magazine, he published in 2013 an article called Shared Value, introducing this concept that actually you can create value and recognize the needs of the other stakeholders. They are roughly, there are many definitions, but we use one that is the 4 C's: your colleagues, the community you sit and serve, the customers that you serve, of course, and the capital markets that provide you the investments and funds to build your business. And over time, this recognition for what is now known as multi-stakeholder growth has become more important. So important that our study actually showed that the multi-stakeholder organizations outperformed on so many metrics the shareholder primacy organizations. Now, we weren't the only ones saying that, but the growth study was very clear in identifying that. And if I just take that one step forward, a year later, I'd like to claim, based on our research, but I'm not going to, the Business Roundtable, the largest US CEO organization, changed after 50 years its purpose of the corporation statement and changed it from a shareholder only to a stakeholder philosophy, saying we recognize all our stakeholders and the fact that we must create value for all of them. Now, that's a pretty big thing. Now, I'll get back to the role of the CMO in a minute, but what's really happened with that is that now CEOs, and I am assuming that most CEOs are caring people, are intelligent people, want to do right by the world, their employees, their customers. Who doesn't? But if your investors are not allowing you to, and you're fired when you distract yourself from pure profit for shareholders, then there's very little wiggle room. And so we kept getting that message of, I'd like to do this, but I can't. I'm an American company. We have different shareholders to those fuzzy-wuzzy European shareholders. That all changed when the founder of BlackRock, Larry Fink, said, no, if you want us to invest in you, and they invest in everything, then we don't just want your profit projections. We also want to hear the other ways that you are creating value for other stakeholders. Now that was the loud signal that CEOs had been waiting for. And that's why the Business Roundtable made that transition, not our study. It was really his statement. And so since then, a lot of companies have been very active in defining how do we do multi-stakeholder growth. And if you were to ask me, what does that even mean? I would say it is that you grow your business, because I think top line growth is still the best recognition that you're creating value. People are saying, oh, I want to give you my money because I like what you've made for me. But, and this is the peripheral second condition, that you are also driving one of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. Now, why those? Why not DEI or equal rights for women or sustainability or 1.5 degree temperature change? Because all of those are included in the United Nations Global Sustainable Development Goals. So we saw that organizations that were able to define how their brands were growing and were helping one or more sustainable development goals, they were outperforming. And now I will finally answer your question about the marketer. Because when a CEO says, we care about all the stakeholders, we want to create value for all of them, the next question is, well, how? What do those stakeholders even want? What are their unmet needs? What are value propositions that we can credibly offer them that are valuable to them? Not us, them. And those are questions which HR needs to ask about the employee, which CSR needs to ask about the community. And guess who's a great partner to work with them to figure that out? Marketing. Because that's what we do. That's what we were trained for. So what better to help the CHRO figure out the employee value proposition than saying, well, what's the touchpoint strategy? What are the unmet needs on short-term growth versus long-term safety and career progression? What is our value proposition? How important is our purpose in driving the reason why people come to work here for 8 to 10 hours a day? And how do we bundle that in such a way and communicate it effectively, not only to the people we're trying to hire, but the people that are already here and that we're trying to keep, so that we increase retention, build loyalty inside. And I can give you case studies for that and internal and external uses where marketing is partnering with the organization. So to now bring everything together, what we saw was that these real growth, we call it humanized growth, multi-stakeholder growth organizations were outperforming the companies that just thought about money, just thought about the bottom line. And secondly, that within these organizations, marketers weren't losing influence. Marketers were stepping up and increasing their influence by partnering both inside and outside the company to make that a reality. And those are the leaders of the future we call Da Vinci leaders. I'll happily tell you more about the Da Vinci profile and how it was developed, but my sense is I should give you an opportunity to reflect and perhaps rebut anything I just said.